Good morning. It's good to be here. Thank you, Dr. Rogers, for that introduction. I also want to thank you, Dr. Dunning, Dr. Edmonds, Dr. Malik, and Connie Leggett. I met Connie maybe about 4 years ago, and she said to me, I want you to come to Albany State. It has taken 4 years, but I have made it to Albany State. So thank you for being persistent. That works. So I bring greetings on behalf of the staff of the Institute for Higher Education Policy, an organization that we commonly refer to simply as IHEP. We are a policy research organization that is based in Washington, D.C., and our mission is focused on college access and success with a special emphasis on policy and the effect of policy on underserved students. And yeah, so our goal is really about underserved students and helping to make sure that the policies that are coming out of Washington, the policies that are coming out of state capitals are really focused on what the needs are for low-income, minority, and other underrepresented groups. At IHEP, we envision a world where all people can reach their full potential by participating and succeeding in higher education. Now, we are actually known mostly for our policy research work, but we have a growing portfolio of work that is tied to institutional research, institutional assessment, and institutional best practices. And this particular work is used to help drive national policy discussions around what works, which is why it is important for me to be here to hear about what you all are doing, because I will take that back to my colleagues about what is working on campuses. Now, I have actually lived in Washington, D.C. for about 14 years, and I'm so glad, Dr. Rogers, that you talked about my early days at King's College, because since I've been in D.C. for more than a decade, I think people think that I've only been in D.C. all my life. Most people don't stay 14 years. It's a pretty transient community, and I've been there for quite some time. But my career got started on a college campus, a college very similar in size to this campus. It was not an HBCU, but it was a school that was serving low-income students in the rural part of Pennsylvania. It was founded for the sons of coal miners. And I stress sons because they finally changed their mission in the 1970s and said we're also inclusive of the sons and the daughters of coal miners. So that gives you a sense of who those students were. So they were very similar to your kinds of students. They just looked different in terms of their skin complexion probably, but the realities of their lives were very much similar. And that's where I learned a lot about policy and decision making. I learned a lot about what it takes to make a campus work, how students experience that campus. And what I didn't know at that time is that experience, those 4 years at King's College, would be so important to my current role and the roles I've had subsequently. Because way too many people who are making policy decisions absolutely know very little about what it takes to make a campus work. Now, that being said, I think many of them know they know very little, and they do reach out to people like you. But what I would like to see happen more often than not is for people like you to reach to them. Because you actually do know what works, and I have learned over the years that people who are on the institutional level, the faculty, the staff, the practitioners, you are at the front line of policy decision making. You are the expert on students. And you are the first responders to their needs. So it seems logical to me, seems quite reasonable, that you should be a part of those policy conversations, and you also must be the catalyst for change, which has been the theme. I guess you've heard that phrase quite a bit over the last 3 days. So this morning, I hope to discuss your role in that change process, particularly as it relates to student access and student success. I want to begin by briefly discussing some of the major trends and issues that are happening at the national level. I want to talk about some of the signs that we're starting to see around those issues, and then I want to conclude just with a discussion about what's actually happening here at Albany State. So, what I would like to also say is very similar to you, Dr. Malik. You know, you're a professor. I'm not a professor, but I kind of want to pretend to be one today. So because I'm going to pretend to be a professor today, I want to start with a quiz. That's right. Get ready. School's in session. We're going to start today with a pop quiz. So take out a sheet of paper. Come on now, we don't have all day, let's move. That's right, I'm a professor. I want you to take out a sheet of paper and I want you to answer these questions. See some people putting on their glasses? Put on your glasses if you need your glasses. Yeah, turn the lights up, okay. Okay, first question, what percentage, and don't yell out the answer, I just want you to write it down. What percentage of all Americans enroll in college? What percentage of low-income students enroll in college? What percentage of all Americans graduate from college in 6 years? And then what percentage of low-income students graduate from college in 6 years? And then the last question is around affordability. How much is the average student loan debt? And when you think about the answers, I want you to think about all students in 2- and 4-year institutions and in the for-profit. So everybody, not just those who are in the 4-year sector, all people who are enrolling in college of some sort. What percentage of Americans enroll in college? What's the answer? No, you all have such low expectations. Not enroll in college. It's 59%. 59, close to 60% of all students are enrolling in some college. What do you think that number is for low-income students? 30, half of that, 30. Now, what percentage graduate within 6 years? Now y'all too high, 29. 29%. And what do you think that number is for low-income students? 11%. What about student loan debt? $29,000. Now, that $29,000 only includes loans from the federal government. The way students get these higher numbers is when you start adding on private loans and things of that nature. But for undergraduate debt coming through the federal student loan program, $29,400. Okay? So these are numbers that are based on national data. And because I'm still in my professor mode, I'm going to give y'all a homework assignment. The homework assignment is to spend some time before classes start in a week and a half figuring out the answers to these questions for Albany State. Just figure out what is the percentage of these students and the numbers for Albany State. And I think this is a very important assignment because, in my opinion, the first step to improving college access and improving college retention is that you have to know your numbers. You have to know your numbers. When you visit the doctor's office, the doctor begins very routinely, wherever you go, they take your temperature, your blood pressure, and your weight. They are managing your numbers. And they do that because that's an important part of staying healthy and assessing your health when you walk into their doors. So knowing your numbers is just as important when you're working on a college campus, and it really does apply very much so to student retention because it is the major way that we can mark progress and really assess the risk. And some people don't want to know their numbers because they say the numbers are bad. But what I'm going to tell you is whether your numbers are good or your numbers are bad, you have to know them because you can't do something about it unless you know what you're dealing with. So that is your homework assignment. Dr. Dunning, you should check in with these people next week before classes start to see how they have fared out with this. But it's very important that you begin the year having a sense of who your students are and how they're faring at this institution. So taking this back to the national trends around college completion, especially things that I'm seeing from where I sit in Washington, I have just a few words to give you as words of advice to help you in your efforts to be strong catalysts for change. And my advice comes in the form of 5 words. And those 5 words are pay attention to the signs. Pay attention to the signs. And I want to just tell you a little bit more about that with a quick story. So about a year ago, it was a Saturday, about a year ago in the summertime, and I needed to make a trip to Rockville, Maryland. And I live in DC, and I live in the southern part of DC. So normally on a normal day, to get to Rockville, it takes about 40 minutes. So I got up, I got dressed, and I left my house at 8:30. Well, I needed to be in Rockville at 9 o'clock, so I'm already starting off behind. And I really needed to be there at 9 o'clock because I needed to meet someone right at 9 o'clock. So I get into my car and I proceed to the interstate, and all of it is pretty uneventful. And as I'm driving, I'm realizing I might be late, and I'm just kind of trying to calculate in my head if I'm going to get there in time. Should I call and say I am late? And what I realized is that I'm speeding. I'm speeding. So the speed limit's 50. I was going 65. And to some of you, 15 miles over the speed limit might not be a big deal. But I actually like to obey the law. And so I wanted to do the speed limit. But I was going 15 miles over, so I said I need to slow down. So I slowed down, and now I'm doing 60-ish. And on this particular highway, it's pretty curvy, and I should also mention that on this morning it had been raining. It was no longer raining at the time that I was driving, but the road was a little slick. And as I'm speeding down this wet highway, now going about 10 miles above the speed limit, I see this sign. Have any of you ever seen that sign before? You've seen that sign? So what does that sign mean? A sharp curve and 25 miles, and I'm going 60. So I saw that sign, I looked at my speedometer, I did slow down, and the good news is that I saw the sign and I paid attention to the sign. And the bad news is, well, there's not really bad news because I'm here and I'm able to tell this story, but the not so good news is that I should have paid attention to not just this sign, but the speed limit sign much sooner. Because the next thing I knew, as soon as I saw that sign, my car started swaying left and right. It was going left, it was going right. I was trying to stay calm, I was trying to control the wheel. And I look up and I see my car headed straight for this embankment. And I'm like, oh my God. And I was so terrified. And it all ended well. I had a major brake repair on my hands, but beyond that, it was fine. But it left me shaken, and it left me shaken because if I had crashed my car, it would have been my fault. It would have been my fault because I did not pay attention to the sign. The first sign of the speed limit, and when I did pay attention to this sign, it was almost too late. So that's my cautionary advice to you all today, to pay attention to the sign. And when it comes to issues around college access and college success, there are quite a few signs all around us. Now, some of you, some folks just don't see the signs. They're just totally blind. They don't see the signs. And then some folks are intentionally ignoring the signs. And then there are others who are seeing the signs too late. I'm going to encourage you not to fall in any of those three camps, but to actually pay attention. And I have three examples. So I want to talk about the first sign. The first sign relates to college costs and affordability. Now this sign, one way. Not only is it pointed in one direction, it is pointed up. And you all are experts, and you all know about college costs and college affordability. Some of you may have kids in college yourself. And so you know that when it comes to low and moderate income families, this conversation about college costs and affordability is pretty straightforward to them, even if it's complicated to us on the decision-making side. When they see the cost, all they see is an arrow going up. And for too many students, money is the issue. A few years ago, I attended a meeting with an HBCU president, and he said to me, Michelle, I have no problems that money can't solve. And I think in all honesty, when it comes to your students, I think money may not solve all of their problems, but it sure probably wouldn't hurt, right? And especially when you think about the HBCU population, 98% of students who attend all HBCUs are on some type of financial aid, some type of need-based financial aid. And when I looked at the data for Albany State, I found out that you all were even higher than that. 99% of all your students are on financial aid. 90% of them are taking out student loans. So that's important. This is very, very important. Let's see if it changed. And then there are some other points that I just want to share with you. College costs have grown nearly 30% in the past 5 years. 70% of all college graduates leave with some type of debt. And the average student graduates with $29,400 in debt. And Black and Hispanic students are more likely to have excessive debt loads. So their debt is beyond that $29,000. Now, when it comes to issues around money, it's a juggling act for many students. And I like this graphic here because it really does show that finances and academic success are really linked and intertwined, and it can have a ripple effect. So you see here this woman, she has a work and loan burden. That's the money she either has to come up by working more or taking out more in student loan debt. So if she works too much, then she's stressed out. She's worried about how she's going to eat and where she's going to sleep. Then that leads to too little sleep, too little studying, poor grades. She then decides, I can't go full-time, I'm going part-time. And then what happens then? She stops. He stops. This happens to a lot of your students, I'm sure. So I really think that when we are thinking about finances, we got to recognize that it's linked to a whole lot of things around student success. Now, on the national level, several years ago, the U.S. Department of Education introduced the College Affordability and Transparency Center, which is really not so much a physical center, it's a website. And it highlights institutions with high and low tuition and fees, as well as those with high and low net prices. And this information is updated annually, and they produce these lists, and they publish them in the Chronicle of Higher Education and things of that nature. I would encourage you to visit that site and simply kind of see where you all fall in comparison to other four-year institutions. You can run lists by four-year status, two-year status, public status. You can generate those lists quite easily. Also, as you know, when it comes to college tuition, the tuition is not set randomly. It's not usually someone in a corner just picking some number. There are several factors that go into that. And for public state institutions, state appropriations play a huge role in tuition setting. And in too many states, appropriations have been reduced, held constant, are just simply insufficient to meet the needs of today's students. And I did some investigating, and I saw that for fiscal year 2015, you all are facing a huge cut. Am I right? Yeah, it was a very high number. And these type of reductions have been steady for the past year. This is a trend that I want you all to definitely pay attention to. From where I sit, state appropriations can affect your ability to not only retain students, but also to attract them too. So when you put all of this together and you look closely at this trend around college costs and affordability for students, the signs are all pointing one way, and that's up. Another sign that we should be paying more attention to are funding gaps and stratification among colleges. And this stratification is not new, but it is growing and creating within our system of higher education a divide. A divide, I would say, that creates more haves and more have-nots, or less haves probably and more have-nots. And this trend is taking us the wrong way. And for schools like Albany State, I suspect that exacerbating this trend will compromise your ability to serve students well. And you all know better than me that institutions like this one and other HBCUs enroll and educate students with the greatest need. Therefore, it seems logical to me that for an institution that's serving the students with the greatest need, they should also have the greatest share of the resources. But it doesn't work that way. Funding continues to work the wrong way. And earlier this year, we produced a report at IHEB. Let's see if I have a copy here. This is a black and white copy, but it's called Minority Serving Institutions Doing More with Less, where we collectively showcased MSIs and what they were doing given some of these funding constraints. And these institutions, on average, receive fewer dollars, and they receive them despite having students with the greatest academic and financial need. Now, this table that you see here shows that four-year MSIs actually receive less federal funding per student than non-MSIs, despite targeted programs, whether through state appropriations or federal funding, that are aimed at these institutions. So concentrate on the second and the third column for four-year institutions, the column that says MSIs and the one that says non-MSIs, and focus on the dollar figure, not so much the total or the percent, because that's complicated, and I have to explain what's in the numerator and what's in the denominator. But if you just look at the dollar figure, and you look at, let's see, this is line 1, 2, 3, 4. So you see state and local appropriations per FTE at 4-year MSIs is about 5,446, but at non-MSIs it's 4,989. So even though for MSIs it's a little bit higher, it's not high enough considering the students and the need of the students. If you jump down to 5, 6, 7, 8, the 8th line, federal appropriations, grants, and contracts, you see that MSIs tend to get $2,249 and non-MSIs $4,971. That's in federal funding. And then if you look at the line, 2 lines under that around private gifts and investment return, that's very low. MSIs $863, whereas non-MSI $6,586. So these are some funding issues that are very, very important to take note of. But what I will say is despite the challenges created by these chronic underfunding scenarios that we see, MSIs are still charged with trying to improve outcomes for their students. And many are doing so in spite of that because the cost of not doing so is too high. The cost of not doing so is way too high. So given the importance, many of these schools are doing more with less. And what I will say is I think that strategy is commendable, but it is not sustainable. Commendable, but not sustainable. And because of that, I say that we should pay attention to this sign, and the sign says, we are going the wrong way. Now, my last sign is a sign that says that there is trouble ahead. And if we don't get a handle on student learning and being able to assess student learning and making sure that we are making improvements towards student learning, there is going to be trouble ahead. Now, institutional accountability is nothing new to higher education, and there has long been a call for the higher education community to provide more meaningful transparency around student learning outcomes and to hold themselves accountable. And this debate has been occurring for some time in the federal level. I've been in DC 14 years. I've been hearing it for 14 years, and it's been going on much, much longer than that. Many of you may have even been a part of some of those conversations. I think that the stakes are getting higher on the national scene, and I think things like President Obama's new college rating system is evidence that the stakes are getting higher. You know, I saw what was introduced under the Bush administration around institutional accountability, and when it came forward, many of the institutional leaders yelled and said, oh no, that's too much, we're not doing that, we oppose that. It's things that came out of the Spellings Commission on the Future of Higher Education. And then President Obama comes in, and what he's actually proposing is much more stringent than what was proposed previously. I think that regardless of who enters the White House in 2016, this issue is going to continue to be at the forefront of political decision-making, and the issue is only going to get worse unless institutional leaders own the problem and fix the problem themselves. If you don't own the problem, if you don't do what you need to do to fix the problem, someone from on high in Washington will tell you what to do, and I guarantee you, you will not like it. So this is really an issue, and when it comes to assessing student learning outcomes, it really is very important, not just because you don't want to be told what to do around people in Washington, but there are other reasons. First of all, I think it can help improve teaching and learning on the college campus level. It can also improve how your graduates succeed in the workforce, and it also happens to improve the country's global competitiveness. Now, global competitiveness is very important. Even if your students decide never to leave the country, it's going to be important for them. And even if they decide never to leave the state of Georgia, it's going to be very important to them. And it's going to be important because whether or not they decide to stay in one place or not, they are going to be competing with people who are all over the world. People who they will likely never ever see, they will have to compete with. So global competitiveness and having the skills and knowledge to be able to maneuver this new global knowledge economy is going to be essential, and failure to give students these skills will leave them and our country at an alarming disadvantage. Now, there are many institutional leaders who have taken this call seriously, and they are doing different things to begin movement towards improving the assessment of learning. Tools like the ones you see here around Common Core and PRAC assessments are happening at the K-12 level. These other efforts are happening at the post-secondary level. And feel free to take a look at them. They all have websites, and they are being fueled and funded by leading foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example, is very heavily involved around the voluntary system of accountability and the Common Core and things of that nature. And the Lumina Foundation is heavily involved in the degree qualifications profile. Now, although there is some movement around identifying and assessing student learning outcomes, there has not yet been broad agreement. And if we can't move more rapidly and more visibly towards broad agreement, this is not only going to hurt the students, but it's also going to have some effect, probably some negative effect on the institution. So that's my advice. Pay attention to these signs. And yes, I think that some folks are paying attention to them, and the fact that you're here is evidence that you all are paying attention. The trouble is that we are not moving quickly enough, and we need to accelerate our efforts. Because when it comes to student retention and success, these things are happening in real time with real-time outcomes. And although there is no silver bullet solution, although there is no one-size-fits-all solution, we have to make some change. And regardless of the difficulty of the task ahead, we may have to change course and change some directions of how we've gone about doing things over many, many years. Now, last thing I want to tell you all, and I was hesitant about bringing this up because I thought, I don't want to demoralize people, but I thought it was important to say, because one thing, I am on your side. But I do want to tell you that when it comes to some people in the policy realm in Washington, for example, and there are also these people probably within the state capital of Georgia, they feel that there is very little value in what you do. They are questioning the relevance of HBCUs, whether or not they are needed, whether or not they still hold significance in this current time. And that is a very real challenge. And for my work, I think it's going to be even more important that in the days ahead, you don't necessarily fight that perception. Whether you believe it or not, you got to acknowledge that it is a real perception. There are real conversations. And what you have to do is make sure that you combat it with the data and with the outcomes to prove that you are relevant, you do add value, and that even though the world has changed and the face of HBCUs have changed, Albany State is very much so needed in Southwest Georgia. So I recognize that I have said a lot, so I'm going to stop talking a bit, and I want to really hear from you all. And I can answer questions, but I did put up these questions that I would be interested in hearing from you all about, but I'm also able to answer some questions. But I really want to get a sense of what are you all thinking about? Like, what are the strategies that you have already either put in place or strategies that you want to put in place, and how do you plan to really assess these and determine whether or not they need to be scaled, how to sustain them, things of that nature. And then I want to hear about things that you are just kind of thinking about, like what might be some innovations that are on the horizon that you might want to see happen here, that you don't know if the money's here or not, but just something worth trying. And then I want you personally to think about what you can do tomorrow. When this conference is over and you're back at your desk, in your office, preparing for the first day of classes, what can you do differently tomorrow to make sure that the effort that the conference planners put into bringing in these kinds of conversations up don't get lost when we have the reality of day-to-day activities in our face? So with that said, we can talk about the questions. I'm open to conversation. I think I have about 20 minutes.
To your model, such as the growth, you talked about the growth of the number of students. You know, in the 1970s, it was 14% of students going to college. Now it's the 50-some percent. What about the growth of universities, and specifically for-profit online degree mills. Where does that come into this picture? Because the competition's part of what's driving our internal problems.
I agree that there's growth. So say a little bit more. Like when you say, what do I say about that? I agree that what you're saying is absolutely true.
Just your thoughts, and are there some policy alternatives? If you look at, and I don't want to name names, but I have nieces, nephews that have attended online universities and not gotten a very good education. They've gotten a piece of paper.
Right. Okay. So I'll just give you some thoughts I have about online colleges, or just for-profits in general. If you had asked me what I thought about them 5 years ago, I would probably tell you that I thought that they were all, what's the word? Aggressive. They use aggressive, manipulative marketing strategies. I think they still kind of do, but they work. And I think that's really what we need to be concerned about, is that they are working. And when I have asked young people why they have made the decision to, say, go to a for-profit that costs them 4 times more than their local community college or the local in-state school, they have very good reasons. Now, because I sit and I know more, I understand that some of the things they've been told is not always quite true, but the students have made a decision based on their need for flexibility, their need for a job, and their need for some type of attention around career placement. So I think that tells us something. We should be looking at the for-profits and seeing, what are they doing that works, and let's do it better. Now, we don't want to be aggressive, we don't want to be manipulative, we don't want to, have marketing ploys that are not authentic and to the essence of the institution, but their marketing strategies work. Their outcomes don't work. And their students leave colleges at a higher level without a degree and with far much more debt than any other sector. The highest percentage of students who default on student loans come out of the for-profit sector. Now, the problem with that is, while we can see that their outcomes aren't great, to be perfectly honest, when we look at the 4-year sector, we can't say that our outcomes are much better either. And so that then means everybody's got to focus on outcomes. Now, from the federal government standpoint, they've tried to go pretty aggressively against the for-profits with this gainful employment provision that was introduced last year. The for-profits have a very powerful lobbying arm, and you know what they did? They sued the government. And they didn't necessarily win, but they were able to stall things long enough to get the provision weakened. So my advice is figure out their strategies for recruiting and marketing the student, and use the best and make it work. Provide students with an education where you can actually prove and show evidence that you are educating them well, you are getting them good jobs, they are leaving with a reasonable amount of debt that they can pay back. And third, strengthen your voice among influential people in the state, in the local community, and outside of the state who can lobby either for you or with you to showcase what you're doing really well. Does that help answer your question? Yes, thank you. Okay.
Question over there.
Yeah. Hi,
Where are
I'm
you?
Ronnie George.
Where? Stand up for me. Okay, there you are. Okay.
And I'm in the College of Education. The first thing I want to say is I wish you had come 2 months ago. A team of us wrote the first in the world grant, and I wish you were here. I have cited almost every report that was published by your unit.
Oh, good to know. Thank you.
The question I have is about the standards. We've seen so many standards, and since we're in the College of Education, we're dealing with, Georgia Performance Standards, Common Core, and as a result of all the different standards that are coming, the testing also changes, and many of our students, especially in Southwest Georgia, are failing the math tests.
Okay.
And I don't know who makes these policies, and many of the tests that we have, I don't think they really assess the students the way they should be. I want to know what your thoughts are on that.
I think, so you say that the students are failing, and that the things that they're testing for are the wrong things.
Because some of the things, I don't know, the standards are changing so much. The students barely get used to one set,
Right.
and there's another set. And I actually pity our students who are teachers in the schools. Every year they're going through training to understand what the new set of standards are.
Well, one thing I'll definitely do is take that advice back. But the other thing that you can do is help figure out what should be the right things to test. So I would say that we're not going to be able to stop the movement towards this testing and standards. So if you can't stop that train because it's got too much momentum already going, then try to improve that train. So try to give them examples of what could be better. People like you all actually do have good ideas that are not being funneled into those conversations, and you can be a part of those conversations. I do know the people who work on some of those assessments. I know that folks at the Southern Regional Education Board, like they've been a part of that. You here, there in Atlanta, you have a right, and if you want assistance or someone wants assistance, I can help you make connections to the right people. But you have to go to the conversation with an alternate that keeps the conversation flowing. If you go in and you simply say, this is not working, we hate it, we don't like it, you should stop, they're not gonna call you back. But if you go to the conversation and say, hey, we don't like this, we hate it, and here's what you should be doing differently, you stay in the loop.
Thank you.
Here's one question, please.
Hello.
Hello.
Your presentation is on the money,
Thank you.
but I have a concern.
Okay.
What you basically presented is what we call strategic diagnosis of higher education. My question to you is, what are your prescriptions for success, especially for HBCUs?
What are my specific strategies for success for HBCUs?
Not strategy, what are the prescriptions?
Oh, prescriptions. Prescriptions for success for HBCUs. So I will say the report that I mentioned before, doing more with less, we've done a number of reports. I mentioned this one because it's the most recent. It came out in February of this year. We also have one that came out in December of 2012, or maybe it was January of 2013, around classroom practices that serve first-generation students really well, that I would also suggest that you look at, and I can send it to you. But if you look at the campus as a whole, doing more with less is a good idea, a good one. And there are 4 recommendations we put into that report. The first one was for institutions to think about strategic planning and strategic realignment of resources. I think this is really important. To really look at areas that are working well and areas that are not working very well, and figure out if there are any efficiencies that can be saved. We worked on a project with the folks at North Carolina Central on this, and they were able to do this and do it well. In the process, there were some growing pains, though. They actually eliminated about 11 departments. They merged 2 of them, but they saved the institution $2 million in doing so. So they're growing pains, and you've got to be able to withstand the growing pains. I would also say leverage opportunities for collaboration. We've seen this to be effective at a variety of small institutions that are central to the communities. You can leverage ways of collaborating inside the campus, as well as build partnerships outside the campus for local workforce development type things that will help students get better jobs in the long run and things of that nature, as well as also probably leveraging your voice maybe more on the state level. We saw that happening at a school that's not an HBCU. It's an Asian serving institution called De Anza College. They had a Title III grant, and through their Title III grant, they figured out ways to do more in terms of internal and external partnerships. The third thing was around data-driven decision-making. So I'm a numbers person, so I believe that you learn more when you actually are honest with the numbers. And we looked at the University of Texas, El Paso, which is a Hispanic-serving institution, and their president has been there for years, and she's done phenomenal things with that population of students. And because she looks at retention as a longitudinal process, she looks at her students and assesses their risk factors and figures out what type of intervention should be presented to them and at what time. So you can't do everything in the first year or the third year, and what you do in the first year versus the fourth year should be different. So really taking a look at what the different interventions are, what the different intervention points are, and using the data to help you identify the risk and the outcomes of the students. And then the fourth thing was something that we noticed from a very small, resource-poor tribal college called Salish Kootenai College. So Salish has all the problems that a tribal college has, and if you think you have some problems, go to a tribal college. They have a lot of challenges for sure. Salish had been very successful at getting a lot of little small grants. They would get $100,000 here, $50,000 there. And what they would always do is that they would create a new program. Every time they got a new grant, they would create a new program until they realized that they had all these programs, no way to sustain them. And once the money was gone, the program was gone, and the students were hurt. So they decided to stop doing that. So they still try to get pockets of money, but what they realized is that pretty much all of their students, 80% of their students needed developmental education. So they stopped creating all of these one-off programs and funneled more of their resources into improving the systems and the supports around, in this case, developmental education. And they were able to see more progress for students who were in developmental ed, who then came out into the regular curriculum and actually were able to graduate more effectively. So that's a long answer to your question, but 4 strategies there that I think we've seen work at MSIs generally, and I think they could definitely work at HBCUs in particular.
Good morning,
Good morning.
Dr. Cooper. Thanks for sharing with us this morning. I had the opportunity to attend an IHEP conference about 4 years ago, and we focused on financial literacy. And as important as it was 4 years ago, it's even more important now. I can say that ASU has not done a good job with financial literacy. Our students generally are late in terms of starting the financial aid process, and even more importantly, I don't think they understand the impact that it will have on their lives. Can you talk to us about best practices that other institutions have used to really drive home this process, and who should be the driver of that process?
Sure. So those conferences on financial literacy, we don't lead them anymore, but USA Funds still holds them annually. So if you haven't been to one recently, just know they always still hold them every February. And one of the things that I found coming out of that conference, the most successful efforts were ones that were tied financial literacy to 2 things: student loan disbursements and the curriculum. So Savannah State was a school, and I don't know if they're still doing this, but they had a first-year experience course, and then they had some other courses that were mandatory for all first-year students. And they started incorporating instructions about financial literacy into those first-year experience courses, and they actually produced a book, a how-to guide about how to do it, and I'm sure that's probably still floating around somewhere at Savannah State, and you probably could take a look at that and see what can be learned and applied here. And the other thing is really around improving the financial loan counseling that comes with loan disbursement. So that's where we have started putting more of our energies these days, and we've decided to put more energy there because the Higher Education Act is up for reauthorization. Probably won't happen right now. It's up for reauthorization at the end of this year. I don't think it's going to happen this year. I don't think it's going to happen until after the election, to be perfectly honest. But we have to start working on it now. And so one of the things that we have been speaking to people in Congress about is changing the structures around student loan counseling. Because right now, when students get a loan, you all might do it differently here, but on average, you go in and you sign some papers and you get the loan, and then you go at the end when you're about to graduate and you sign some more papers and you see, oh my gosh, I got all these loans, and there's nothing that happens in between. So these loans just keep adding up, and you're not really aware from a student perspective, and then you're just like, now I gotta pay 30 grand back, I gotta figure it out. So we have been saying that there are things that can be done to improve the loan counseling in a more comprehensive fashion and a more annual fashion, so students are knowing each year how much they're taking out on debt and what that equates to a monthly loan payment post-graduation. So that's one of the things that we've been doing. And so if there are any people in the room who are working in financial aid, would be happy to talk more about that, because one of the things we have been told is that it would create more burden for financial aid administrators. And that might be true. But what I also hope is that it would actually help students be able to take out either less loans or understand what's expected of them at the end when they graduate with the loans as well.
I don't have a question per se, but I want to talk about the retention and the completion here at the university. I've been at Albany State for over 20 years. And when I stepped on campus, education to me was given on a personal level. I feel like we've strayed away from that. I feel like we don't look at the whole student per se. I think we look at more of a business aspect of it versus looking at the total student. So I think as far as retention or completion, maybe we need to start looking at what brought the students here in the first place and focus on that factor.
Well, I think that's a good point, and it's a point that, we try to talk about in a lot of the things. So, for example, with student loan counseling, much of the counseling is automated, and we said that one thing that helps students still is people. You can't get rid of the people dimension. But even as I say that, we're working within restraints, financial restraints, and it's harder to staff probably the way it was 20 years ago just due to some of the funding realities that you're probably now having to grapple with. And so when you have funding realities, usually that means that you have less people, or you may need to hire less, or you may need to get rid of some divisions, and that then creates a strain on people. So my advice is recognize that we are working and operating in a different world. So as I think I heard earlier, in the new normal, the world is different. And so we have to acknowledge that, the folks who are making decisions are requesting and mandating that outcomes be talked about in ways that do feel very corporate. But when it comes to students, they are people. And you also have to realize that students receive information differently today than they did 2 decades ago. So my mother was mad that her grandkids don't call her. I said, learn how to text. You talk to them all the time. And she does. And so, we have to recognize that the way they communicate is not the same way. So we have to change, what does personal mean for students in the 21st century? And I think that probably looks different, and we need to make that adjustment, and we need to, deal with the realities that we have around the corporate mindset, but not in a way that changes the character of what makes the institution special to the people who benefit from it.
Dr. Cooper, I have a question.
Okay, where are you? Oh, there you are.
Our institution, Albany State University, as well as the HBCUs in the nation, depend on federal funding called Title III. Mm-hmm. Here at the institution, Title III funds most of our retention efforts, and we hire over 100 people. What are the trends in Congress? We were promised our allotment in March, and we haven't gotten it yet for our Title IIIB. And we have found that over the years, the total amount that's dispersed by Congress has been about the same. Do you see that it's going to stay about that, or do you have a feeling that they're going to decrease that amount?
I don't know the answer to that question. So I think that there are people who want to decrease it, as we saw with sequestration, and they're not going to stop that fight. Whether or not they will win that fight, I'm not sure, but that fight will continue. I do know that when it comes to Title III funding, people from that office, actually as recently as last week, have stopped by our office because they're trying to figure out ways to change the eligibility for Title III to make it more focused on outcomes. Because they're feeling now that, some have been saying in Congress that, you're just giving away this money and we're not seeing the outcomes. And so the Title III people are trying to figure out, so what are the right outcomes that we should be asking? So now that you know that they're having those conversations, I think you should be a part of that conversation. The new Deputy Assistant Secretary who manages Title III, his name's James Minor. He was recently up in Atlanta at the Southern Education Foundation, so he knows Albany State. Come visit him. Go talk to him. Get to him now before he starts feeling that pressure from Congress. Because what happens is when they're in the midst of the fight, all they can do is fight. And it's hard to then figure out where do I go for information when you're in that battle. So now before the battle comes, knowing that it's going to come, But, the next time we have a budget cycle, it's going to happen. I think now is a good time to engage him and just know he's talking about outcomes. He has that pressure. So what would be the outcomes that you all would recommend that would actually not harm you, but help you and help the students? I think would be a good start. But in terms of whether the funding is going to be decreased, I don't know if it's actually going to happen, but I do know that it's going to continue to be debated.
Very good. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I'm going to go through and you did mention a few articles that will help HBCUs improve enrollment. One, do you have best practices? Do you know any university that is going out there to look for more students? We have HBCUs who have a limited population. We have a limited target population. I do know that for A&M is going to Brazil to recruit foreign students. They are increasing the number of students they have. Albany State University has also gone to Nigeria. One of my friends had to go to Nigeria. They brought in 200 students. Each of these students is paying $25,000 a year to bring the students here. Do you know other trends which HBCUs can adopt in order to increase the number of students and, of course, increase their financial capacities?
Well, I think the route you're suggesting is, looking internationally to bring students in from other countries. And when I was working on campus, we definitely did a lot of that. We would go to the Bahamas and bring in lots of Bahamian students, and that helped. But that doesn't still solve the issue, So I think you have to do multiple things on recruitment, and I'm not a recruitment expert, but what I have seen is certainly international admissions could help. I think looking at the marketing strategies of institutions like the for-profits, who are really, a lot of the students who would have come here are now going there, looking at that and seeing how to maybe enhance what you all are doing in terms of marketing, figuring out where your niches are. You probably have already done that. The whole online movement is something maybe worth considering. And I say that with great caution because you could spend a lot of money in terms of going online and it might not work. But I learned completely by accident that some schools who are going online, they have it outsourced. So it could look like Albany State, but somebody else is managing it. University of Southern California, their whole online program is managed by somebody who is not the University of Southern California. It's a man in an office in Maryland. It's really interesting how these things are working. But that's something I would look into. I can certainly look more when I'm back in my office, but I do think that you have to probably be a little bit more creative with recruitment, a lot more aggressive, and you have to recognize you're in Southwest Georgia, and I think there's probably an obligation, so to speak, to serve this community in many important ways. And there are probably other institutions who are now doing that as well. But you all have been here for a while, and so I would certainly encourage you to continue to be a leader in that regard, recognizing that the days ahead will not be easy, but what you do now, I think you said it, how do we look 100 years from now? What you do now will determine where you are 100 years from now. So I say all of that. I want to thank you for allowing me to come here. I thank you for sharing with me. I will spend my entire day here, so I hope to learn a whole lot more. And I think you can feel free to call on me and my colleagues at the Institute for Higher Education Policy. I'll put my email back up here. You can email me, and if you are into social media, I also tweet, so you can follow me on Twitter. Anybody in here tweet? Okay, so that's problem number one. Your students are tweeting. They're tweeting right now. So that's my email address. So seriously, they are tweeting, they're on Facebook. That's how they communicate. So if you want to be connecting with them, you're going to have to change your communication strategies. Pay attention to the communication signs as well. Really important. So thank you.
Thank you.